Well, hi everybody, welcome to Afterburner. I'm Bill Whittle. You know, I've been doing a lot of air travel lately, and needless to say, for those of you who don't know my background, flying is in my blood. So I thought that some of you non-pilots out there might get a kick out of learning a few things that go on while you eat your pretzels and sip your Cokes. So for a change of pace, why don't we pick a random flight from LAX to JFK? How about United Flight 867, just as an example? So let's start at your departure gate. Now, up in the control tower, there are actually two different kinds of activity going on. At LAX, for example, there's LAX Tower and LAX Ground. Ground is responsible for what happens on the taxiways. They're the guys that make sure that the airplanes move safely from one place on the airport to another. LAX Tower, on the other hand, controls the airspace around the airport and the actual runways themselves. So before you can actually go anywhere, the pilots have received a detailed weather briefing and a flight plan. They then contact LAX Ground for the pushback. The ground controller will then give them taxi instructions to move them from the gate to the actual departure runway. Now in our case, that would sound something like United 867, taxi runway 25 right via Charlie, Charlie 6 and Bravo. Now taxiways, unlike runways, are marked by letters in little black boxes or yellow boxes. The taxiway you're on is marked with a black box. Runways, on the other hand, are numbered, and the runway number corresponds to the nearest magnetic heading. So as you turn the corner, you might see the runway painted 25R. That means that the runway is heading more or less 250 degrees. That's just a little bit south, 20 degrees south of due west. And since LAX has two parallel runways on the south side of the airport, the one on the right is 25R, which is runway 25 right. Now once you get to the departure end of the runway, the pilots change radio frequencies from ground to tower. As I said, all towers control not only the airspace around the airport, but the runways as well. The pilots will switch to a tower frequency and make a call something like LAX Tower, United 867 Heavy, holding short 25 right. Then they'll wait for the magic words, United 867 Heavy, cleared for takeoff. Then they taxi into position, spool up the engines, and off you go. Now, virtually all modern commercial jetliners have two engines. The jet engine is an incredibly reliable piece of machinery, mostly because it essentially just has one moving part, the turbine. Older piston-powered propeller liners had literally thousands of banging, rattling pistons and valves and rods and cams. And all jets have to be certified so that if one engine should lose power, the other engine has enough reserve thrust to safely continue the climb at a reduced rate, even when the airplane is fully loaded. So as you accelerate down the runway, one of the two pilots is visually flying the aircraft while the other is watching the airspeed indicator. If an engine were to fail early on the takeoff roll, they'd simply hit the brakes and abort the takeoff. But at a certain predetermined speed, which is based on aircraft type, weight, current atmospheric conditions, and so on, well, at a certain speed, one pilot will call out V1. Once you hit V1, that plane is going to take off even with a failed engine because there's no longer room to stop. Now, engine failures are very, very rare. And even a failure at the most critical instance, really just a non-event, the plane just climbs out on the good engine, turns around, flies downwind a little bit, comes back, and lands. When the pilot watching the airspeed calls out V2, the pilot flying will pull back gently on the controls. Now, this raises the elevators on the tail, which actually pushes the tail down. That increases the angle of attack on the main wing, and up you go, usually at a climb angle of about 12 degrees or so. The landing gear comes up almost immediately. That's pure drag. It's just like holding your hand outside the window. All it does is slow you down. Now, as you climb away from the airport, you get handed off to another air traffic controller who's watching a radar scope far from the actual control tower. He's responsible for the aircraft coming out of LAX. Now, in our case, that will be SoCal departure, and your flight would be handed off from the tower with a call something like United 867 Heavy, contact SoCal departure on 124.3. Every instruction, by the way, has to be read back by the pilots to confirm that both parties are on the same page. 24.3 for United 867 Heavy. Frequencies are crowded. You got to be quick. You'll fly a standard instrument departure, pretty much the same thing every time, depending on the general direction you're heading, unless you're headed up the coast north for San Francisco or so. That means out of LAX, it's a climbing left turn just off the Palos Verdes Peninsula. Below 10,000 feet, you are limited to flying below 250 knots, but it doesn't take you very long to get 10,000 feet, and you accelerate as you continue to climb to cruising altitude. Then you level off, and things become nice and boring. SoCal Departure hands you off to Los Angeles Center, which controls a huge amount of airspace. And as you enjoy your movie or try to sleep, you are in fact probably around flight level 370 or 37,000 feet. That's 7 miles above sea level. And your airplane's doing about 540 miles per hour over the ground. Now that's in still air. But the air at 37,000 feet is far from still. You're in the jet stream over North America, and it's blowing you towards New York at speeds of up to 100 miles an hour. Having the jet stream as a tailwind will usually subtract about 30 minutes from your flight time. That's good. The problem is, coming back, that tailwind becomes a headwind and adds about 30 minutes to the return trip. That's bad. Now, as far as air traffic control is concerned, your flight is now just one of thousands of blips moving along very precisely defined high-altitude airways. There actually are highways in the sky. Some of you may have seen one of these odd-looking structures out in the middle of nowhere. It's called a VOR, for Very High Frequency Omnidirectional Range, and it's essentially a radio lighthouse that transmits a signal that radiates out like the spokes on a bicycle wheel. Now, these aerial highways lie along these spokes, and at certain places where they cross, well, that's called an intersection, and each one of these intersections has a unique 5-letter name such as Bassett and Bindi and Civet and so on. Now, a few times during the flight, you'll reach one of these intersections or you'll overfly one of these VORs on the ground, and you'll notice the plane will make a slight bank to pick up the new airway. Los Angeles Center hands you off to Denver, Denver Center hands you off to Kansas City, and so on. By the way, turbulence is unpleasant, and sometimes people can get hurt if they're not wearing their seatbelt, but the airplane cannot be hurt by turbulence. All jetliners are built to withstand stresses many, many times greater than what the worst turbulence can dish out. Even if you get into some really bad air, it may feel and look and sound like the plane is coming apart, but believe me, it just can't. Turbulence simply cannot break a modern airliner, and that goes for the little commuter propeller planes as well. Now, the way down is basically a mirror image of the way up. You'll begin your descent a long way out, probably about 120 miles east of Long Island, more or less. New York Center hands you to Kennedy Approach Control, and as you get closer, a few really interesting things start to happen out on the wing. You may sometimes see a little panel come up off the top of the wing. That's called a spoiler. It makes the ride a little bit rougher, a little bit louder. What it's really doing, though, is it's killing the lift behind it, and it's a way of descending a little more steeply without diving the airplane and gaining speed. But watch the back of the wing as you descend, because modern jetliners have a problem. You see, the more curved the wing is, the more lift it generates, but also the more drag it creates. The problem is, we really want two different kinds of wings. We want a very curvy, large wing so the plane can fly slowly enough to take off and land, but we also want a smaller, thinner, cleaner wing so that it can go fast up at high altitudes. And so the wing actually does change shape in flight. As the flaps come out and down, the wing gets a little bit larger and a lot curvier. That means more lift at slow speed and a lot more drag. You hear the thump of the gear coming down a couple of miles out. Approach will hand you off to Kennedy Tower, and again, the pilots will hear some magic words that sound like United 867 Heavy, cleared to land. And all during your approach, you're actually flying down two perpendicular radio beams. One of them, called the Localizer, is a vertical beam, and that tells you whether you're left or right of the runway. The other is a horizontal beam called the glide slope. It tells you whether you're low or high. Now, all instrument-rated pilots have to be able to manually fly their airplane, keeping these two needles centered right on the localizer and the glide slope. And if you do that, even though modern autopilots do it much better than you can manually, you can essentially land that airplane in near zero visibility. Now, once you touch down, all of the spoilers immediately deploy automatically on the top of the wing, killing all the lift, because once you're down, you want to stay down. The pilot will then pull the throttles back past the idle detent, and in most airplanes, clamshell doors will close and redirect the jet thrust forward to slow you down. That's why you hear that roar from the engines as soon as you touch the runway. Then with the wheel brakes, you'll continue to slow down until you're clear of the runway, at which point it's a little chat with Kennedy Ground Control to get your taxi instructions back to your arrival gate. And that series of miracles, and we just scratched the surface, happens about 30,000 times a day in this country without a single fatality in a major U.S. jetliner in the last 11 years. That's 120 million domestic flights, more or less, most of them with 100 or more people aboard and not one single person killed. It's the wonder of the age. So, blue skies, everybody.